I'd just like to thank again our academic panel. I just thought they did a super job. I appreciate their commitment to be involved in this thing. We want to continue to do this as part of our outreach to have people that we can highlight from the university. And I think it reflects well on the kind of people that are involved in our academic programs and the research and development that's going on in the university. So we're pleased to highlight that and pleased to show that off today. Let me turn back over to Randy, and Randy will introduce our industry panel, and we'll go on with the discussion of the same general topic, but from a perspective of someone outside of academia.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks for everyone's participation this morning. That was very eye-opening, and I think we're going to follow up on the industry side. So keep some of the questions and some of the commentary that we had in the first session in mind as we walk through this, and we'll see about advancing this dialogue forward. We're going to do introductions, and we're going to turn to a very similar format as our first panel. First, from my left to right, our first industry expert here is Mark Bowling. He's Executive Vice President of Southwestern Energy Company and President of Southwestern's B+ Development Solutions Division. He has a law degree from Southern Methodist University and a Bachelor of Science in Geology from DePaul. And in 2012, he was named Innovative U.S. Lawyer of the Year. Next to him is Christy Desjardins. She serves as Senior Vice President and General Manager of Saxum's Houston office. In that role, she oversees client service and leads communication strategy for Saxum's energy clients. She has more than 25 years of corporate communications and public affairs management experience. Next to her is Ray Dewar. Ray is a senior economic advisor at the American Petroleum Institute and a member of API's Media Relations Department. She's one of API's principal spokespersons and covers a wide range of issues affecting the oil and natural gas industry. She has a master's in economic development and East Asian studies from American University and a degree in history and political science from State University of New York. And finally, but not least, Andrew Weissman. He is the founder of EBW Analytics Group, a market advisory service that provides cutting-edge analysis of the U.S. and global oil and natural gas markets. And he currently serves as the senior energy advisor to Haynes & Boone and is an honors graduate of Harvard Law School. So I give you our industry panel. We had some very interesting dialogue over the past couple of weeks, and we look forward to advancing that. So consistent with the format this morning, we're going to have an opening statement, so to speak, for 5 minutes for each of our industry representatives. And the opening question is this: are environmental protection and industrial growth inherently incompatible? And we'll start with Mark. So let's go.
Thank you very much, Randy. Short answer, no. Next speaker.
You can reserve your other 4 minutes.
Okay, yeah, reserve my other 4 minutes for rebuttal. What I'll talk about here, since we are an academic institution, I'm going to put this in the form of a report card because I got so sick of those things, and I can imagine you're still having to deal with them. You're glad that now we're going to put industry under the microscope of a report card and see how they're doing. But as you can tell, it's a midterm report card because we are, I mean, probably not even at the midterm, but at least we know that there are things that can change before the final grade hits. And as you'll see, in my opinion, there's a lot of things that need to change before the final grades hit. But let's take a look at the first subject, geosciences. I think by any stretch of the imagination, you have to give industry an A. I'm just a tough grader. I'd probably give them an A+ if I wasn't being so tough, because of the things, the technology they've been able to employ, what we now know about mineralogy, fluid compatibility, hydraulic fracturing design and optimization, fluid flow dynamics. It is truly incredible that we're able to produce hydrocarbons from this nano-Darcy rock by drilling down over a mile and then go horizontally and bringing it up. So there's no question that I think industry deserves an A in geosciences. In terms of economics, I give industry a B+. primarily because, like the intro to economics, it's both a microeconomics and a macroeconomics. From a microeconomic standpoint, I think industry has done very, very well. Being able to drive down the break-even price in many basins by innovations like pad drilling, vertical integration. Like Daniel said this morning, it is a lot about economics. We are able, obviously there's core areas and non-core areas, so it's not like we just have one big shale formation and we're going to get the same results no matter where we drill, but we're got a pretty good idea where the hydrocarbons are now. It's not as much exploration intensive as it is engineering intensive in making sure that we get the economics right. So on the micro front, I think we have done very, very well, and we continue to impress in terms of our learning curve improvements. On the macro side, obviously supply continues to outpace demand, and we got graded down there because I think, in my opinion, I know, but I'll just say I think, that we don't seem to get a full appreciation of what the MATS rules, what the Clean Power Plan can in fact do for our industry. We seem to be more focused on exporting natural gas when the market in how natural gas could take over a lot of the power production for coal, et cetera, and the Clean Power Plan, in my opinion, would be more immediate and would ultimately dwarf the amount of natural gas that we might be able to export in the future. So that in that case, I think we need to do a better job of recognizing the macroeconomics. C plus on supply chain management. Why do we get a C plus? Because really there's three components to it. Can we get our product, and what we're talking about is how good are we at getting our product from wellhead to burner tip. The first aspect of that is, can you get it where you need it? Can you get it when you need it? And how efficient are you? What is the energy delivery efficiency of the system? And in terms of the can you get it where you need it, I think last winter in the polar vortex, a lot of people were questioning whether or not natural gas could really be as reliable a fuel as everyone was counting on it being, especially in light of the fact that of the Clean Power Plan and how much reliability on the future natural gas combined cycle was going to be there. But it's important to point out that in terms of those that held firm capacity on the system, virtually everyone got their gas during the polar vortex. And we have situations which comes under item 2, which is can you get it when you need it. We have situations again, in my opinion, electricity markets, especially those in the competitive markets, there's some restructuring that needs to be done because there's no incentives for some of those folks up there when they're bidding into firm capacity to hold firm capacity in the sense of capacity on the power side, and they're bidding into that competitive market. Currently, there's no incentive for them to hold firm capacity on the gas pipelines to really be bidding in their firm capacity. So we need to do something, I believe, to recognize that capacity in the power side to be firm really means you better have firm capacity in some way on the natural gas system. The other side of it, though, is how well are we coordinating scheduling, et cetera, with the power markets. And there, it's been kind of no, I don't want to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. 9 o'clock Central Clock time is just fine with me. And it's dangerous because I think the power folks wanted to start it at midnight, and we said, no, 9 o'clock is just fine, and we have to change all of our NASB contracts, blah, 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 whine. And I think what really needs to be done is recognize that the power sector is one of our largest customers, and I don't know anywhere else where someone could treat their customer like, no, I'm not going to do it. You know, that to me is stupid, but it's going on. And so what I think needs to be done is obviously there's got to be some compromises, and I think they're looking at some compromises that will fit. But we need to realize that we have to provide products that are in services in terms of transmission that are more in tune with what our customer needs. And then in terms of energy delivery efficiency, I think that obviously there's a lot of positive things happening, but just looking at from the satellite images of the amount of flaring that's going on around the country in areas is appalling. And for us to think that we can't do something more about that is silly. If we are able to drill down more than a mile and hit a 60-foot target and bring up hydrocarbons from this nanodarcy rock, but we can't figure out how to keep it in our system, and we can't figure out how to get it to the burner tip better, to me, that's really unacceptable. And I think the answer there is we have to take that same innovative thinking that we have used and really monopolized below the ground and start applying it above the ground. That will allow us to find these solutions to, I think, our legitimate questions about responsible drilling. And then the last is social studies. We got a D there, and we could have gotten an F. With a few exceptions, a few notable exceptions, I think anyone that's, to be fair about it, would characterize the debate about hydraulic fracturing as it's emotionally charged debate that is more like a trench warfare that is not really debating the real issues of responsible development of this resource. Certainly on one side you have certain environmental groups and I say certain because not all. They're not all created equal, but we do have certain environmental groups and media outlets that are waging an unprecedented misinformation campaign about hydraulic fracturing and what it is and what it isn't. And this campaign is clearly designed to evoke an emotional response and not have an intellectual debate about the issues. But on the other side, you have industry, excuse me, that's spending more time trying to minimize the public's concerns about hydraulic fracturing and not enough time just identifying what the real risks are and being clear about what we're doing to mitigate those risks. Human nature is such that if you tell someone don't worry about it, do you think they like to hear that? No. And especially if you tell them, oh, don't worry about it, we've done this for 60 years without a problem. Don't regulate us out of business. I'm here to tell you what we did 60 years ago doesn't even resemble what we do now. And we lose credibility as an industry when we continue to say we have done this for 60 years without a problem, don't regulate us out of business. Because it's just flat not true. The scale of what we do, how many trucks go up and down the roads, how much water we put down, how much water comes back up, what we have to do with it, has absolutely no semblance of what we did 60 years ago. And I think we need to stop doing that. And this resistance, the other problem I think is the general resistance to regulation has really now become a defensive posture for all of industry. And that has caused us to really not acknowledge legitimate risks. And there are legitimate risks out there. And what we need to do is just say, yes, there are risks. Here's what they are. But this is what we're doing to mitigate those risks.
Christy.
Okay, thank you, Mark. That's a great segue for me. I am not a scientist or policy expert, but I focus on publics and how to engage with them. So I'm going to come at this from the communications perspective today with a look at challenges and opportunities that the industry faces. So to start, I'll make the observation that the public debate on energy generally only scratches the surface of the impact that energy has on our lives. And these points being the most commonly discussed amongst the public. And again, these are very high-level generalities, but the common points are the fossil fuel-based energy is finite, it is too expensive, and it's wreaking havoc on our planet. These are general public opinions. That renewable energy sources are plentiful enough to replace fossil fuels in the short term. And that energy companies are motivated by profit to the point of making poor decisions for the environment. What too often is left out of the debate in the public is that energy is the backbone of the American economy and the very essence of our quality of life. That today we lead safe, technologically driven lives with better health and more economic opportunities than ever before, and largely thanks to the provisions of energy. So the public's lack of understanding and the narrowing down of the debate, the fear that was talked about earlier, is not helping the industry. It puts them at risk for stakeholder and activist attacks, threatens its license to operate, and can lead to poor public policy decisions. So what do we do about it? Well, beyond the rigors of the public debate, there are a few communications-related challenges that plague the industry. It's an extremely complicated business. We've heard this in multiple discussions today. Most people don't understand much beyond the price they pay for gasoline, or the piece of equipment or project that's being built in their backyard, or near a public landmark that they care about. And the larger environmental debate items they hear in small, targeted, bite-sized pieces of the news media are from an anti-industry point of view. And the industry, to Mark's point, doesn't do enough to counteract that with information that's helpful to their own perspective. They're highly personal messages. The opposition's argument that fossil fuels can be replaced today with cheap, abundant, sustainable, green energy, Freudian slip, is so compelling. It's not true, but it's compelling, and that's an argument that the industry is losing, just on public opinion side. The industry loves its data, and don't get me wrong, data is very helpful. We've seen some wonderful statistics today, but when the opposition's message includes pictures of small children or dirty water or fire coming out of a kitchen faucet, these are messages that are hard to compete with, and the industry's losing that battle because we counteract it with just throwing tons of data at the situation, or statements like, we did it great 60 years ago and we can do it great again today. The public is now very savvy about using social media to connect with each other and to get their messages out more broadly in ways that are important to them. These connections are often very one-sided because the industry is not weighing in. And finally, the final challenge I'll mention for the industry is that energy companies generally are only comfortable in forums they can control. So advertising, their own company website, speeches to friendly audiences, and interviews with news media that are highly controlled and highly scripted. So how do we begin to engage in a more meaningful way with the publics that are making decisions and that are engaging with the opinion leaders who are making decisions on our behalf? Well, if I knew an easy answer, I would sell it to every one of you and I would get rich. Barring that, there are a few things I think that we can think about. First, a good start would be to make a more serious investment in all forms of communications and engagement with publics. Energy takes money to find, produce, transport, market. Serious consideration should be given to investing more in interacting with the very publics that are threatening those capital and operational investments that we put so much money toward. Keep the data, but add some personal what's in it for me storytelling. I think that telling stories about how energy helps our lives be better is going to be very helpful to folks, and also provide some data with them along the way. Use targeted media. We must use a variety of tools to reach the varied interests of stakeholders. This has to include digital channels targeted to stakeholders you want to reach and to what they care about. The bite-sized loving digital trending Americans are demanding it, and industry needs to step up and get into that game. And finally, some of what you heard here today, get out there and tell your own story. These conversations are often one-sided because the industry is afraid to weigh in. We have for many years put ourselves in a place where we are only willing to say what is legally required and have been uncomfortable talking about anything else. But it's time to stop doing that, have real, open, two-way conversations. So the bottom line, industry companies face an enormous number of challenges. Communications is one of those. And like exploration, production, refining, technological advancements, Communications requires a large investment in time and money. We haven't been doing that very well as an industry, but it's time to start turning that tide if we want to be a part of, as was said earlier, to decouple the public policy debate from the scientific debate and begin to help Americans understand exactly the ramifications of these decisions being made on their behalf. Basics like a functional website, clear internal communications, crisis planning, and even branding are sorely needed. Social media and grassroots campaigns are a huge bonus. Agencies like Saxum and others and internal communicators at industry companies understand the energy industry can help guide this investment to the most innovative and engaging solutions. And I will tell you that my belief is companies that stand out with smart, effective marketing communications will arguably drive value to their shareholders and investors.
Right.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I really enjoyed the panel this morning. It was very interesting, and it's a big treat to be here. And it's really awkward because I can't see behind me, but I'll try to talk anyway. I think reliable, affordable supplies of energy really mean everything to our way of life. They mean everything to our economic development and even our ability to protect the environment. So I thought it'd be interesting to just look at how we've been doing, not so much a report card, but just where have we been, and then where we might be headed with the energy portfolio that we have today and what we can see maybe over the next 20 years or so. And this slide is from the EPA, and I don't know if any of you have seen it, but I thought it was interesting because it shows how we've changed from 1980 through the year 2013. Our gross domestic product, for example, went up 145%, that top blue line. Vehicle miles traveled, 95%. Population, 39%. I love these numbers. We can get back to the fact-based approach. 25% growth in energy consumption, 14% in carbon emissions, and look at the 6 common pollutants, down 62%. I think that's a pretty good report card. And then I looked at where we might be headed with the energy portfolio we have that the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, thinks we're headed. And that'll change with policy, but it generally changes fairly modestly. There's not a whole lot you can do with shifts in energy in the short term. Long term, you have a much better opportunity. But look at almost a doubling of the GDP is expected over the next 25 years or so. 17% growth in population, 9% in energy, and 3% in CO2 emissions. The final slide I found very interesting. This is from the EIA. That red line in the middle just shows our carbon emissions from, what was that, 1984 to 2013, and then where they think we're headed in the future. And I find it really interesting because it is a shift. And the point we're at today is fewer carbon emissions from energy-related sources than when we peaked back in 2007, and actually at a 20-year low. They see a gradual increase from this point forward, and a lot of this sort of modest growth in the United States is not only assumptions about energy efficiency improvements, but it has to do with innovations in the oil and gas industry, especially those innovations in horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, allowing us to bring massive amounts of natural gas into the marketplace at a pace and a rate we didn't expect. And it really has shaped and changed the slope of this curve and the expectations for our future. And this is all dependent on technology. So there's a very important role for fossil fuels to play. They have played and continue to play. But at the core of this will be technology. And I think the one thing we always do is underestimate the power of technology to transform our lives. We can see right in front of us, but we are always surprised, and we're always working to solve these problems. And I believe strongly in our ability to make a lot of progress. But I'd like to take some credit for the industry in being able to move the slope of this line down further than where it had been, thanks to the innovation that's happening in fossil fuels and in the state of Oklahoma. Thank you.
Thanks. I think you've heard some tremendous comments today. I think this is one of the most helpful discussions I've heard on very complex issues. And what I'd like to speak about just briefly is what lessons can we draw about what we need to do to solve the problem. And by saying we, I mean not just industry, but I mean particularly and most importantly, a lot of the people in this room and elsewhere in academia. Because I think essentially where we are now is that we do have the capability of making major progress in reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. In fact, we have started to make significant progress, in no small part due to companies right here in Oklahoma City and companies like Mark's company based in Houston. There's a story that's not been told enough, I think, about just how much credit the oil and gas industry deserves for the progress that's already being made. If you look, U.S. emissions of greenhouse gases have been declining. And if you look at what's caused that, increases in renewable energy have played a very important role, but the breakthroughs that have occurred in natural gas development have played an even greater role. And more than half of the reductions in emissions that have been achieved in the United States over the last several years are because of the breakthroughs with horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing and what that's meant for the supply and cost of natural gas. And what's particularly interesting is that a lot of those savings, a lot of those reductions have occurred at little or no incremental cost, just because the industry has been so spectacularly successful in providing greater supplies. But I think essentially the key issue, basically at this point, is that essentially part of what you've heard from the first panel that is, I think, extremely important, is that in terms of we've spent a tremendous amount of money on scientific research regarding whether the planet is warming and on important work that's been done to assess the potential impact, particularly on a long-term basis. And that work has been very important, and it needs to continue. But I think what you heard from the panel this morning, that's just from the first of the two panels, that I think is just as important a message, I would, at the risk of oversimplifying, characterize as being essentially that in formulating an energy strategy, that essentially we already know enough. And I think where the most significant issue that we need to be addressed now, and I hope that the Price School of Business and the Energy Institute will help address this, is a question of, in terms of analytical work and in terms of rolling up our sleeves and figuring out how to solve the problem. Are we asking the right questions? What are those questions? What should we be focusing on with our resources? And I think in that regard, we have literally are spending probably at least hundreds of millions of dollars a year on the basic research on climate change, and that's important, and I don't mean to diminish that in any sense. But we are spending closer to zero on two issues that I think are at least as important, if not more so. One, I'll characterize as being understanding what the implications of the scientific research are for policy formulation. And second, I'd characterize as being developing optimal plans that optimize for achieving significant reductions in emissions. And let me explain what I mean by each of those. In terms of the first issue, understanding the implications of the research that's already been done for further action. There is a clear, simple message, and I'm borrowing this, maybe stealing it from a talk I heard many years ago by a professor named Daniel Schrath from the Department of Atmosphere, who's the chair of the Department of Atmospheric Physics, Atmospheric Science at Harvard. And what he said essentially is that climate change is essentially an insurance issue. a risk management issue. And that basically, if we step back, this really is a no-brainer. I think if we look at this honestly at all, that what we see clearly is that there already are abundantly clear indications that the risks associated with climate change are enormous. And it's not even just the risks, as some of the presentations this morning showed. We've had years in which there have been up to 100,000 deaths a year, where there's every reason to believe that the level of warming of the atmosphere that's already occurred is causing enormous damage, at least contributing to the damage that's occurring. And that is, if what we focus on is risks, that is scary as it could possibly be. Because as most of you probably appreciate, with climate change, it's not just a question, the focus is often on what's the current emission level and can we reduce it over time. What's important to recognize is that warming is not a function of the annual emission rate of greenhouse gases. It's a function of the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so every year that more greenhouse gases are emitted, the problem gets worse and worse and worse. And since no one would contend that we can instantly even cut our emissions of greenhouse gases in half, the problem is going to get worse and worse and worse in every year. And if we look at it from that perspective, one message that I would draw from that, and it's obviously a topic we could talk about for a long time, but one that I think is particularly germane and relevant to everybody in Oklahoma in particular, is essentially if the risk gets worse and worse every year, if every ton of CO2 emission and ton of other, the 5 other greenhouse gases emitted causes the future problem to be worse and worse and the future risk to be greater, surely what we ought to do is that we ought to look for everything we can do quickly that will slow the increase in cumulative emissions. And that, to a very large extent, we don't do. And you've heard some important examples this morning. Earlier in the earlier panel, one issue, for example, may sound like it's just one specific, but it's an important example, is the discussion of using wood or in underdeveloped countries as a source of home heating. And also, many of you may recall what happened in China last fall, where there was tremendous, overwhelming pollution to the point that they literally had to shut down major cities. The main cause of that was kind of one of the most inefficient, dangerous uses of coal imaginable, which is to use coal in boilers in individual buildings where the boilers are tremendously inefficient, so you have to burn a lot of coal to do a little bit of heating, and there are typically no emissions controls at all. If there were more work done to try to identify what are the no-brainers, what are the problems that certainly have to be solved, we would be focusing a lot more attention on issues like that, and be trying to make sure that on a global basis some of those things are taken immediately. Here in the United States, in terms of what we can do here, essentially what's happened, I would say at a macro level, you've heard Mark and others talk about the issues pertaining to hydraulic fracturing in particular. And Mark's company deserves tremendous credit for being really the leader within the industry in trying to act responsibly and develop workable solutions to minimize both to act responsibly as an energy producer and to reduce what really should be needless controversy. But if you look at least I would contend, what really has prompted that debate, I think it is in part a lack of understanding of some of what I've just described right now. Because in the end, when you work with many people in the environmental community, essentially, in terms of the way, and many people, not just within the environmental community, think about the climate change issue. They think about it in a way that academia should help to refine and improve. And essentially, there is an awful lot of thinking by very well-intentioned people, often very knowledgeable people, where basically the notion is that the only thing that we ought to be focusing on with respect to dealing with the climate change issue is getting as quickly as possible to zero emissions, and really in particular zero emissions from the power sector. And at its root, a lot of the opposition to hydraulic fracturing was less because of concerns, it was as a result of deep analysis of whether there really were risks as a result of use of hydraulic fracturing, which is, I agree with Mark entirely, those risks were just enormously exaggerated. But it was more just kind of a knee-jerk gut reaction that said, my God, essentially we've got to get by 2050, what the goal is, we have to get by 2050 to zero emissions. And anything that interferes with that is by definition terrible. And that, I think, reflects a not very well thought out definition of what we ought to try to achieve. And in particular, it ignores what I was just talking about. I mean, if you look basically a reduction in emissions by substituting natural gas, which is a lot lower emitting fuel, for coal in the next 12 months, if you're thinking about what concentration levels will be in the atmosphere by 2050, that will reduce emissions for 35 years. And that will essentially, if you make those reductions quickly, first of all, that will contribute a lot more to reducing concentration levels in 2050 than anything you could do with 30 or 40 years from now to reduce emissions. And so in my mind, at least, with options like that, it really, I feel, I'm concerned about climate change. I'm concerned for my children. I'm concerned for my grandchildren. I personally feel it's morally wrong to kind of dismiss quickly the notion of taking those steps without doing very hard work to understand where there really is a solid, legitimate basis for the concerns. And that essentially, that framework for looking at these issues, I think, hasn't been developed well enough. And that's something I think academia can contribute to in terms of understanding the issue. And the second, the last point I'll make in terms of where there's a need to apply a lot more brain power and objective, rigorous analytical work in terms of addressing the climate change issue relates to the question of developing near-term plans for achieving large reductions cost-effectively. And when I look at that in particular, that's true in many areas. I've already given one example in terms of the use of wood and coal for home heating. There are many others. Switching to LED lights, for example, on a very large scale for lighting in urban areas is another example that just only a handful of cities on right now are focusing on right now. But the main event, and the one that I would hope that this institution and a lot of others can help contribute to, is going to be, it relates to EPA's Clean Power Rule. And some of you may be familiar with that, some of you not. But essentially, President Obama proposed about a year and a half ago now, maybe even closer to 2 years ago, a major new initiative relating to emissions of greenhouse gases from power plants. Essentially, this is round two of the president's efforts to deal with climate change. And as many of you may recall, that has always been a very high priority for the Obama administration. When the president took office, basically priority number one was health care, priority number two was getting climate change legislation. The administration tried really hard for 2 years to accomplish that and ran into, realized it just wasn't going to happen. And essentially, after that occurred, both the White House and the environmental community went back to square one and tried to come up with a new approach. And ultimately, the approach they decided to take was to try to use really a fairly obscure provision of the existing Clean Air Act to go ahead and by the vehicle of new regulations, impose pretty require very major reductions in emissions of greenhouse gases from existing power plants.
Hey, Andy, I'm glad you brought that point up. I'd like to transition that and open this up to the group on that, because that's an issue I think that everybody is wrestling with right now.
Let me just say one
Yes.
more sentence, Randy. I'm sorry for going on so long. Just the conclusion of that is essentially there is an urgent need for more work, more rigorous analysis from sources without a vested interest in determining how to implement that program, which is going to be issued in final form in just another 4 or 5 months.
That's a great point, and it ties in really to one of the wrap-up questions we had on the first panel, which was about solutions. And at least one of the solutions that has come out of DC is exactly that, Clean Power Plan. And the solution to climate, in many people's view, is that to force carbon controls via regulation. And so that's a question for the entire panel, and we can start it off with you on your response, Mark. How do you think the attempted forcing of carbon controls on the energy sector, how do you think the industry has responded, and what do you think the ramifications of those regulations may be?
Are you talking about both Clean Power Plant and the methane emission stuff,
Yes.
or you want folks? Okay. Well, in terms of methane emissions, I don't think the industry has responded very well. I think there is a lot we can do to reduce methane emissions cost effectively, and we need to do it. So I guess that's the bottom line on that. In terms of the Clean Power Plan and its impact, I think that you have to look, again, this is from my perspective, you look at what, not too far in the past, all we did as an energy company is, our business model is, look, we've got to find a product and be able to sell a product that is both affordable and reliable, right? So we got this binary analysis here. It's got to be affordable and reliable. Well, now we have what I have called the energy pyramid. We've got to have something that's not only affordable and reliable, but low carbon. So our business model is changing. We can sit there and moan and groan about it and say, no, it shouldn't, because you can't prove that anything's happening with with climate change, et cetera. Or we can say, we're going to do something about it. And it doesn't bother me at all for natural gas. We're 90-some% a natural gas company as opposed to oil. It doesn't bother me at all for my product to be called a bridge fuel. And the reason why it doesn't bother me at all is because, number one, that tells you that we do have a very important part to play in achieving a secure, reliable, low-carbon energy future for our country. Now, the question is, how long is the bridge, and what's going to happen on the other side of the bridge? And to me, our industry needs to step up and say, we're going to do whatever it takes to be relevant, continue to be relevant on the other side of the bridge. How do you do that? Well, you figure out how to harness energy from natural gas without burning it. Focus more on things that will be responsive to this problem of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and its impact on our world. Because quite frankly, I think we can do better in that regard, and we need to.
Ray, how do you think DC is responding to carbon controls and proposed regulation?
Oh, I don't know. DC's always freaking out about something. You know, it's primarily right now, the regulations are primarily hitting coal more than any one. Refiners know they're next on the list. And in terms of oil and gas and regulations, we feel like, you know, it's death by 1,000 cuts is the general feeling. In terms of methane emissions, now that you bring it up, we have reduced methane emissions from our operations by about 73% from hydraulically fractured wells in the last couple of years. If you go back about a decade or so, or less, we've increased production by about 35% and reduced emissions by 17%. So we're on a good path, and in terms of low carbon emitting fuels and technology, this industry, the oil and gas industry, invests more than the federal government and almost as much as all industry combined over the period from 2000 to 2012. So we want to be the next new thing, the next technology, the next investment, the next thing to lower emissions, even as we try to provide reliable and affordable fuel to consumers. So we're out there. I think we're doing a good job, but we can always do a better job. There's no such thing as this job being over or having reached the goal you need to reach. And in terms of a framework for global, reducing global emissions is very complex. And it has to be, when we go down this path, it has to be environmentally effective. Whatever we have coming at us, it has to work. The cost has to be worth the benefit. It has to be transparent. Everyone has to buy into whatever policy we come up with. Beyond this sort of command and control and a regulatory framework, when we look at a broad framework for addressing emissions. The other thing is identify, as you pointed out, the most efficient ways to do this. There are low-hanging fruit. We can go for that first. And don't rule out the fuels or the low-emitting fuels. We have to use those as a priority. Natural gas is certainly one of those. And don't export the emissions. You know, if you put this cost on U.S. business and just export those emissions, this is very complicated, very hard to solve. And I think if it was easy, we would have solved it already. But our companies are out there. We're looking to the future. We're going to hear from ExxonMobil at lunchtime. I don't know what he's going to say, but they are one of the companies that are looking at, for example, algae as a renewable fuel of the future. So there's a lot of investment going on and a lot of money going to universities to try to find some of the best thinkers out there. And you're among them. You're part of this solution and the solutions we need to answer the questions and especially to find the solution to how do we address this problem and how do we keep growing our economy. And we've been doing a pretty good job, but we can always do a better job, all of us. So I'll look forward to hearing from you soon.
What's going to happen now, the way to think about the carbon rule in particular, is that we haven't had a national energy policy for a very long time. And realistically, not very likely we're going to develop one soon. Also, realistically, it's very unlikely that Congress is going to deal with the issue of power sector emissions of CO2 anytime, certainly during the remainder of the Obama administration, but in all likelihood at any point for years for various reasons. What is going to happen in practice to some extent is, I mean, it's the way the real world works as opposed to the theory that we all learn about in college, basically. And essentially, what is going to shape national policy on power sector's contribution to energy supply is what happens in actually literally 100 different, or 96 to be precise, different proceedings in 48 states. I think Hawaii and Alaska are exempted from this. But essentially, once the Clean Power Rule is adopted, that essentially in every state, there will be proceedings both before the State Utility Regulatory Commission and before the State Air Quality Agency to try to develop a plan for for complying with these new requirements. There will be litigation. There is uncertainty about whether the requirements will ultimately be upheld by the courts. To a large degree, though, come August or so, when the final rule is issued, the train is going to leave the station. And so the battle that's going to occur in each state is going to be extremely important. And right now, essentially, some representatives of some interests are likely to be extremely active in those proceedings. It's less clear, particularly for the natural gas industry. Mark is a lot more knowledgeable about this than I am, but at least my impression is that it's less clear how active the natural gas industry will be. So what's likely to happen in particular is that the coal industry will make a tremendous effort to influence the results of the proceedings in every state. The wind industry in particular, kind of a not all that well-known fact is that for years and years and years, GE in particular, as one of the major providers of wind technology, has spent tens of millions of dollars a year to influence what happens in the state regulatory proceedings. The environmental groups will be extremely active, but they will have a very specific focus. It's to some degree a lowest common denominator focus, that within the environmental community, while there are a lot of leaders, as Mark was alluding to previously, who recognize the potential benefits of increasing utilization of natural gas as part of a realistic strategy. They might say just for the next 10 or 15 years, but they, behind closed doors, would agree that that ought to be part of the solution. In terms of the lowest common denominator, from the perspective of a lot of environmental groups, there's an awful lot of pressure to focus strictly on what can be done with renewables. And so there'll be kind of two missing pieces. My fear, at least, is that there'll be two missing pieces in what will happen before the state commissions. One, I believe at least, that there could be a tremendous contribution made by academic institutions and other groups that really don't have a particular axe to grind other than coming up with the most efficient and effective solutions. And two, I think the question of whether and what degree the natural gas industry participates in these proceedings will be very important. And all I can do now is to emphasize that essentially this is the forum in which a lot of these issues are likely to be resolved. And we've been in a situation where these issues have been on the table for decades in many respects. And it's important to recognize that while the debate is going to continue for a very long time, there finally is going to be action, and it's going to occur fairly quickly, and participation in those proceedings could prove to be critical.
Thanks. I'm going to turn the next question over to Christy. And in your opening remarks, you had some covered the issue of renewables, and thanks, Andy, for raising that one as well. What are the limitations and the role of renewables in addressing energy demand and climate change? And we'll start with Christy, but I know everyone here has some thoughts about that.
Okay. So I think, again, I'll step back a bit. So, limitations It's me? Okay, move my technology off the table. Maybe. I don't know. Antenna. So I think that from the perspective of the public debate around limitations of renewables, again, as I said in my opening remarks, you referenced, there is a perception that renewables are available now in huge quantities and that can take the place of the energy sources that we use and rely on today to power our world. And that's simply not the case today. There are economic considerations with the ability of renewables to take those places today. We heard from the academic panel a lot about the geographic considerations around where renewables are available and how those can begin to be a part of the energy mix in any particular region. And then there are the public perceptions of what's possible and what's desirable in this renewable space. From the perspective of, again, I come from sort of the communications perspective, and I will say that I think one of the limitations on renewables is that there's a lack of understanding and education from the general public on what the possibilities are and what's reasonable and what's economically viable. And so I think it's incumbent upon the industry to continue to get out there and talk about, when I use the term industry in this case, I'm going to say all industries. Every single industry that is creating energy today should be talking about the information that should be available to people around how energy can be produced today and for the future, and the technology that's being developed and the pace at which it's being developed in order to make that happen. I do think education is going to be very important and key, and that's at all levels. We heard someone mention earlier about everything from kindergarten all the way up to folks very well advanced and very smart about a lot of other issues. So we've got to be getting out there and talking about the opportunities of the situation. I think one of the things that, as I look at, something I should have said earlier, I used to work for a CEO that said something very interesting to me one time, and I heard him say this multiple times in speeches, but it's always stuck with me. He said, "This is an honorable business. We provide a resource that is absolutely inherent in the world that we all live in today, and without it, our world would be shockingly different, devastatingly different. But we don't do a good enough job of telling that story." So I think that as we think about the limitations and the opportunities of renewables, we can't lose the fact that the work that's being done by all forms, the industry that's producing all forms of energy, is honorable. And we ought to begin to think about it that way and look at it that way. I wanted to say that right then because I'm not sure I'll have another opportunity to say that, and I should have said it earlier. But I do think education, I think beginning to shift the tide of looking at energy as was mentioned earlier, demonized, to be more about it being an honorable line of work, an honorable industry, and an honorable part of the world that we live in.
Other comments, and especially predictions on where we can see renewables go in terms of our percentage of energy use in the U.S.?
Well, I can quote EIA's data right now. We use about 9% of the energy that we use are renewables. And their expectation is by 2040, and they tweak this every year a little bit, depending on policy and the projection we're at, is that 13% of our energy needs will be met by renewables in 2040. So that's the path we are on today. Over 80% is fossil fuels. The expectation is it'll be about 80%. Oil demand fairly flat in the United States for the foreseeable future due to energy efficiency improvements in our vehicles. So that's a picture, that's a puzzle we have to solve. I mean, that's the reality. And there is this sort of waving a magic wand, well, I'm just all in favor of renewables, and a perception that somehow the fossil fuel industry, the fossil fuel industry is just being stubborn and holding us back from this renewable future. And nothing really can be further from the truth. They're looking all the time at all different sources of energy and all different kinds of technology. So going back to a fact-based approach and making sure we have the facts And we don't. We have a lot of misperceptions, a lot of ill-informed talking points back and forth, and it really has to start with facts, with truth. We have a big puzzle to solve, big energy needs, and how are we going to do this? And demonizing the industry that allows for our lifestyle is not the way we're going to move forward.
I would say, in terms of the percentage specifically, I don't think there's any way you can really predict it. In all due deference to EIA, they've got to make certain assumptions about, for example, I just call them behavior influencers. Okay, how RPS standards? Are you going to have more of that? Are you going to have is the assumption that it's going to be 13%. Does that mean we are going to have a production tax credit? We're not going to have a production tax credit. Where we have an investment tax credit, et cetera. So, plus it also has certain assumptions, I would assume, about the technological advancements between now and then. And so I think that it's very difficult, just like it was, the same folks that 4 or 5 years ago predicted that we're going to have all these, we're going to need LNG import. Now we're saying LNG export. Oh, it was a typo. I meant export. And so we got to be careful about, I think, some of those predictions.
Well, I just want to clarify that. Their predictions are based on policy that exists today. So they're looking at the portfolio today and the policy we have in place today. Their projections change as the policy changes. So what they're looking at right now is a modest increase in renewable fuels based on the path that we're on, the technology that we know we have. And as you just pointed out, things can change, and especially technology can change that entire vision.
Just say two things quickly. One, maybe just a little further explanation for those of you who are not familiar with some of the issues regarding renewables as to what the core problem is. And I would agree with Mark that it's hard to predict with any precision what the market share of renewables will be down the road. I think it's safe to say it will increase. The question is how much. The problem with renewables, as one of the speakers in the first panel indicated, is the problem of intermittency, that essentially both with wind and solar, that they're available some of the time, and they can make a tremendous contribution when they're available, but the availability swings back and forth. And with wind in particular, unfortunately, one of the characteristics of wind is essentially that the highest availability is in the middle of the night and when it's relatively cold out. And the lowest availability is on the days when in most parts of the country electricity demand peaks, which are the hottest days during the middle of the summer. And so what that means, and literally what that may mean is that in a state like California, which has one of the highest renewable standards in the country, on the hottest days of the summer, in the middle of the day when electricity demand peaks, the amount of wind that might be available for the entire state might be the same as one natural gas combustion turbine. That's actually the order of magnitude of the figures. And so, and it's not just the problem that it won't be available at the times when you need it most, it's also the further problem that it may wind may suddenly drop greatly, and so you need to have a lot of backup power. And these problems, in principle can potentially be at least partially alleviated if we develop a cost-effective commercial scale storage capability. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist yet. And unless and until that exists, two things will be true. One is we simply can't rely solely or even primarily on renewable energy. There will be limits to the extent to which it can be used to reliably supply electricity. And secondly, because of the need for backup power, essentially, with each increment of wind in particular that's added, the incremental cost, the all-in cost any emissions reduction that's achieved gets higher and higher and higher and higher, because you increasingly have to keep online generating units that you may only use a few hours a year. And if you look at the cost associated with that, that's just terrible. And that issue of the true incremental cost as we expand renewables, to the best of my knowledge, has never been carefully examined by much of anyone. It's an issue that, for various reasons, people have tended to just stay away from, and that's, I think, unfortunate if we're trying to develop a cost-effective solution. Second comment I'll make, close to a one-liner, basically, is I think to try to distill at least some of the points I've been trying to make and what I think is essential for the debate. What doesn't exist, to the best of my knowledge, in a really meaningful way, is a well-done, comprehensive, objective study of, if you wanted to develop a comprehensive strategy to take advantage of all the low or moderate cost options in order to obtain very substantial reductions in emissions. And what would you do? What would the overall program look like? And I think it would help this debate over the pathways we should follow a great deal if there were more work that's done in that area. Because essentially the way the debate occurs currently is it's at a very abstract level of principle of saying, we need to go all renewables, or et cetera, or et cetera, et cetera. Whereas I think if you start trying to develop a very detailed plan, and particularly if it were developed from kind of a neutral, objective source, then you can start making very specific comparisons of, okay, we understand you would like to increase renewables even further. We're not necessarily opposed to that. What's actually feasible and how much does it cost? And I think if we can move the debate to that kind of level, we're more likely to achieve a realistic, more effective solutions and to somewhat reduce the bitterness of the debate.
Yeah, it's clear that renewables are going to be part of the solution, and I want to gear our sort of final comments toward the issue of solutions. And Bruce kicked us off in talking about a balanced approach. And so besides renewables, what do you all see as sort of the essential elements of a balanced and effective energy plan that takes into account environmental protection? And you can answer that in the negative. You can tell us what you don't think will work. So we can start with you, Mark.
Why are you starting with me? I want to see what they have to say first.
We'll go to Christy.
Okay, what will work, what will not? The short answer to that is I have no doggone idea what's going to work and what's not. I guess I could say, and it'd be a provocative thing to say, especially coming from a fossil fuel industry representative, is that you could try putting a price on carbon. If you do that, you would, I think, need to put a value on flexibility. Because if you really are trying to get this down to dollars and cents, and you have and if we are going to be serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and transitioning to a low carbon energy country and world in a cost effective way, how do you go about doing that without putting, and you say there is a value associated with a particular source that can generate power without greenhouse gases. The easiest way to do that is to put a price on carbon, right? The other aspect of it, and that doesn't mean that I'm proposing it, because I'd probably get fired if I said that.
These are hypothetical.
Yeah, purely hypothetical, and it could have been my evil twin up here, not me, that's actually saying that. But seriously, I mean, if you looked at PJM did an interesting analysis here just recently on implementing the Clean Power Plan within their territory and figuring out what the true cost of it would be. And that obviously, in doing that, they basically came up with a cost of carbon. And it was really quite simple. People say, well, how do you put up cost of carbon? They did it in a way which was kind of an iterative approach to say, okay, we've got this stack of sources here, and what we're going to do is just keep going back and forth between the low carbon and the least cost until we get what the stack looks like. When you bid into the market, the day-ahead market, what does that stack look like when we have to comply with the limits on the emissions, and what would it look like if we didn't have any? And the delta is the price on carbon. So pretty simple. Whether or not I could just see, that's going to be turned into it's a tax and it's going to do this and all that kind of political CRAP that we have to deal with. So I don't know. I get kind of frustrated when I get into that part of it. So I probably ought to just pass the mic.
Chris, you can jump in on this.
Yeah, I'll say something just incredibly short here, but I guess the right answer is everything should be an option, right? If you're going to find the right mix, everything should be an option. We should look at what's possible, look at what makes sense, and at the risk of letting my politics show here, let the market decide. That's all I'm going to say.
Boy, it's a big issue and a big challenge, and I think energy efficiency is going to be key. Technology is absolutely key. Making sure that we fund the best and the brightest and really focus on education, that's going to be key as well. And I like your emphasis on identifying the low-hanging fruit, identifying the areas where we can make a difference, and that can be different in different states and in different areas around the globe. But there's a lot more in-depth work that we can do there as well. So it has to do with energy efficiency, technology, looking for the low-hanging fruit, and encouraging facts, the absolute facts when we look at the complex problems that we have. And it's really hard to get over the talking points and really get down to that nitty-gritty and look at this problem in a holistic way and how we're going to solve it. We're not going to do it alone. We're going to have to do it with the rest of the world. And the thing that I'm encouraged by is that we've been such leaders in technological innovation. And I have great faith in a lot of that, and that is going to help us along the way.
Yeah, I'm going to end on a very highly qualified note of optimism. And it's optimism partly to throw out a challenge to everybody in this room and at the University of Oklahoma. And that is, I would have said 5 years ago, based upon where we were then, that essentially the issue of whether we could make enough progress in limiting increases in emissions of greenhouse gases was such a formidable challenge that it might be impossible, that there might not be any way we could achieve sufficient reductions to really make a major dent in the problem. I no longer believe that. I think what we've seen is that technology is evolving in such a powerful way. And the natural gas industry in particular has done such a spectacular job in making available a lower emitting fuel. And there are so many other areas of technological progress, including in solar, for example. And we've seen enough of a turnaround in China, for example, which is now one of the most, the notion that it doesn't matter what we do here because China's emissions are going to go absolutely bonkers. China's economy is going to continue to grow, but China also is now one of the more proactive countries in the world in trying to limit the growth of emissions. So I think the raw material is there to develop programs that actually could make a difference. And I think for that to happen, two things are essential. One is we have to redefine the problem. We have to realize that the risk associated if we don't take some measures to curb emissions of greenhouse gases are overwhelming. The debate over whether whether it's warmer this year than last year, and if so, how much warmer, is utterly misdirected. If you look at the basic science, as everybody on the first panel agreed essentially, and you look at the risk that the further accumulation of greenhouse gases over a period of the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years is going to create potentially more severe problems, that risk is clearly enormous, and it's even, there was a reference to tipping point. There are episodes in the history of the Earth where suddenly we've reached a tipping point and temperatures have increased by as much as 5 degrees centigrade in 10 to 20 years. And the problem is we don't know what that tipping point is. We don't know whether we're very far from it or whether by 7 years from now we're going to hit a level of CO2 in the atmosphere that's going to lead to catastrophic consequences. And particularly in that context, to just tolerate that risk and say, we won't worry, I don't see how anyone can responsibly do that, and I think in some of the choices that need to be made near term about whether we can try to aggressively expand use of natural gas and whether we do at a minimum everything we can to keep existing nuclear plants alive, because the likelihood is that nuclear will shrink significantly, not that it will grow. You know, I think if we redefine those issues, the basic questions we have to address, some of those issues might become easier. But I think even though there are opportunities that in addition to reduce emissions, in addition to redefining the problem in the way I suggested, the critical element, and I'm sorry to beat the drum again, is whether we do a lot more work to try to identify all the low-hanging fruit and develop optimal strategies for achieving significant reductions near term. And that's not what's happening now. Even with the Obama administration's clean power rule, essentially there's been a political decision made not to try to accomplish significant reductions near term in order to get in place a program that ideally by the next round in 2030, after the first set of requirements have timed out, can be tightened enough to reduce emissions between 2030 and 2050. We shouldn't tolerate that. It's going to take a lot of work, though, by institutions like this to help get a better understanding of the issues.
I think we have time for a few questions, and then we'll move to lunch. So let her go. Question.
Hi, thank you. John Westerheide with GE Global Research. I really appreciate the discussion today. It's been great. My question is maybe a little bit more tactical, so I hope you bear with me. In a time of industry-constrained budgets, how do we encourage the industry to invest in technology to ensure the proper management of hydrocarbons once produced, when investment in new technology to produce more hydrocarbons is often much, much more economic and financially attractive? And how do we do that without relying on policy and regulation, which I think is not the desired outcome from industry?
I would probably challenge your last statement. From my perspective, I don't care whether or not it comes from a regulatory standpoint or not, as long as it's smart regulation. As a matter of fact, I think that it's not going to cut it for everyone just to say, let's do best practices, don't regulate us, you know, we've got this covered. I mean, let's be realistic. Number one, it's not true. And number two, when you have an environment where the public believes that we're under-regulated or not regulated at all, continuing down that road doesn't seem like a real viable alternative. What I think we ought to do is focus on these risks in the way that anyone would, whether it's regulatory, contractual, or whatever. We need a system of effective risk management. And that is what smart regulation is. You identify what the risks are, you calculate what the probability of occurrence and the impact is, and then you define mitigation strategies. And so why we can't apply that in the regulatory context is and say that that's okay as long as you do it smart. But the only way you're going to do it, and we talked about this a little bit, talked around it, I guess, is if you have risk communication and collaboration between the folks that are being regulated and the regulators. We can't expect them to come up with smart regulations if we're not willing to sit down in a collaborative fashion and talk about what those are and work them out. And so what I believe ought to happen is, and we all know too, and there's another thing that I think is a problem here, and that's our brains have two spheres. We've got a left brain and a right brain, okay? And a lot of times the education that I hear we're talking about today is great, but it goes right to the left brain, okay? And that's not where the problem is with the public a lot. The problem is the right brain. It's the emotion part of it. So we have to figure out a way to address both of those issues and realize that without appropriate risk communication between us and the regulators, what you're going to end up having is, because public policy and public opinion are driven by perception, not reality. And so if we don't have, as an industry, effective communication along those lines, then we cannot expect to have effective risk management and smart regulation.
I'd like to add just one comment about the American Petroleum Institute where I work. We've been around since 1919, and our charge, actually, Congress asked the oil companies to form the association to put in place best practices and standards. We have over 600 of them regulating the industry. States have adopted, I think, 3,300 different recommended practices. The federal government references them about 300 times in the rules and regulations. So we are an industry that's worked very closely with government from, over 100 years at least now. And we're always trying to manage risk, and we know better than anybody the risks that are there. And it makes economic sense to do so. So in terms of even trying to capture the methane emissions, that's an economic decision. You don't want to see them go up in the air. And we've struggled with that because of the infrastructure, and because our development is far surpassed the infrastructure to get our product to market and to capture some of these emissions, especially up in the Dakotas. But we realize that as part of our business practice, and that's a job that's never done. As soon as they have a new best practice, there's always an issue. There's always some new technology to address and advance. But that's part of industry, and it's part of our culture, and it's part of what we do. I think what hurts the industry is duplicative, overlapping rules and regulations that don't help the safety and actually hinder the development. And getting that right is very difficult, and is part of that interaction between us and between regulation. We like to know what the rules of the road are. We want to have that certainty. We don't mind that. It's just when it's not helpful and doesn't achieve the objective that we run into problems.
I think we have time for you.
Yeah, if I can say briefly, I think at least for part of your question, empirically the answer is very clear but very unpopular, which is that we need a mix of market-based systems and selective government support in certain areas. And I say that I was deeply involved with the first cap-and-trade program for acid rain. I had nothing to do with creating the notion. If you don't like it, don't blame me. But I basically was the person who went out and made it work. I did 12 of the first 13 transactions under Title IV for acid rain. And one of the things that became clear is what a cap-and-trade program does is that it does a magnificent job of prompting innovation and of achieving major emissions reductions at much lower cost than is expected. What it's terrible at is basically that it's short-term optimizing, and therefore it sends price signals that create a strong disincentive to invest in the development of new technologies or other techniques that will only pay off longer term. And so government has to address that by selectively providing support. And there are pretty good models for that. One in particular relates to shale development. Because if you look, there have been some administration claims that the federal government contributed to the development of shale. Boone Pickens has said that's the biggest pile of whatever that he's ever seen. It's true. If you look at what made the shale revolution possible, industry deserves, in my mind, it's a heroic contribution. Risk-taking, and that's where 99% of the work was done. But two pieces that were critical were researched by the National Energy Technology Laboratory. And they were in two very small areas, in a sense. And one was the drill tip, the technology for monitoring at the drill tip at very great depths. We're nettled that it may have been a $5 million research project, but that they did research early on that was critical. And the other that was even more important, I asked when Steve Dixon was running Chesapeake, I asked him if he had to point to any technology that was pivotal in in causing the shale revolution. The answer is really that it was a combination of developments, many other areas, but the single most important, he said, was microseismic technology, and that too was a National Energy Technology research project. So it's very hard, it's very controversial, and it's very hard to pick the areas where you want to devote government money, but that is, I think, critical to the solution too.
I think one more question. You're the winner.
Looking at some of the technical advancements in the energy industry, it reminds me of Mr. Boland's earlier point about how it only took 66 years to go from the Wright brothers to the Apollo moonshot. I also know that a lot of that development, the Wright brothers' first airplane, is extremely limited. And I know that renewable energy right now is a very limited part of America's energy mix. However, from the Wright brothers to the moonshot, there was a great deal of federal investment from NASA, from the military, and other agencies. How can the energy industry work together with the government to help create that same technical leap in renewables?
How can the renewable energy industry work with government? Is that the question?
How can the energy industry as a whole work with government to promote technical development in renewables?
Well, I think a good example of that, obviously, is again, I go back to the terminology I use as a behavior influencer. One of the behavior influencers that the government can use is incentive-based regulation, right? And whether that's investment tax credit, production tax credit, or whatever, I think that's fair game. I mean, it would be disingenuous for me, who is a recipient of all the benefits associated with the Section 29 tax credit, Section 107C3 high-cost gas exemption when that was back before when we had regulations. That, I mean, in all due deference to all the technical work that has been done by GRI and others, those, especially the Section 29 tax credit, was, I think, critically important to unlocking a lot of the mysteries of getting hydrocarbons out of nano-Darcy rock. And to say that that's not also fair game for the renewable industry is, I think, not the right thing to say.
I'm not sure that your question is quite the one I would ask. And I mean this very seriously, very, very seriously, because I think in terms of the future of the oil and gas industry in Oklahoma, this may be an absolutely critical question. Right now, if you look at the objections to expanding use of natural gas and ways to potentially address them, in terms of an example of targeted federal support, I personally would like to see some limited money devoted to doing two things. One would be to demonstrate the potential use of carbon capture with respect to natural gas-fired plants. And the second is that there is a lot of work, there's some very promising work, I don't know whether GE is involved in it or not, it might be, involving fuel cells that use natural gas. They're both very low emitting technologies. If there is reason to think that if you applied carbon capture to gas-fired combined cycle units, that essentially you could reduce the emissions by 90%, which means you'd have a economically dispatchable, reliable generating facility that probably would be very low cost, that would have roughly 2% of the emissions of a coal-fired plant. And if you look at the aggregate emissions nationally from widespread deployment of that technology, it would be minuscule. That, in other words, it may potentially be one of the best almost zero emitting technologies available. And I think, whether we should actually deploy that on a large scale, scale level, et cetera, I won't touch that issue right now. But in terms of the objections to using expanded natural gas use to achieve major reductions near term, if there was a realistic plan for at least trying to develop that technology, it might diffuse a fair amount of the opposition.
All right, we're heading to lunch. Can we get a hand here for our industry panel and our morning